Michael Cholbi, thank you so much for joining us on the Science of Psychotherapy. It's really wonderful to have you here. We've had a review of your book already by our wonderful friend Gunnar Minute, and it was just a great opportunity to get to speak to you about it as well. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm pleased to be here and I'm pleased to see the review as well.
Yeah, and you're in. Now, I don't know. We're raining and having a terrible time here, but you're in sunny downtown Scotland, or are you in?
I am in the center of Edinburgh at the moment. We're, I suppose, making the unruly transition from winter to spring. So, we'll have a day or two of winter and then a hint of spring, and then
Yeah.
it'll show up maybe sometime in May. But
Yeah. Yes.
Edinburgh weather is a friend, but a very temperamental friend. So
Yeah. Yes. My wife and I have had a couple of lovely visits there, running in between sun and rain. But it's a beautiful, beautiful place. We really enjoy it. Now, this title of this book is actually what perhaps, because our audience is mainly psychotherapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, practitioners of mental health. It's Grief, a Philosophical Guide. But I'm attracted to it because it is a philosophical guide, and that this is terribly important in our concept of the science of psychotherapy, is that the science, because we argue that science is the knowledge of, the gaining into, the getting some understanding of. And this is what I think I see you going through this book, sort of pulling us all into a framework. And what was this framework? How did you find yourself, what was the motivations that brought you into doing this?
Well, there are a couple of motivations. One of them, I suppose, originates in teaching. So as a researcher, much of my work as a philosopher has addressed various questions related to death and mortality, ethical issues related to suicide, assisted dying, the desirability of immortality, these kinds of things. And at a certain point in my teaching of that subject, I began to notice that the way a lot of students were relating to this material was not really by thinking about their own mortality directly, but rather by referencing their experiences of other people's deaths.
Yeah.
And so I began to explore to what extent my discipline, philosophy, had investigated, this phenomenon of grief. And somewhat to my surprise and consternation, I guess you could say, they hadn't really investigated all that thoroughly. It's not a topic that shows up in most of, I suppose what we think of as the major treatises in the history of philosophy. It's not to say it doesn't make any appearance. There's some comments on the matter in Plato and in the Roman philosophers, Montaigne, Augustine, a few other figures. So part of what brought me to it was, again, that sense that maybe I could draw my students into these questions about mortality by talking about grief. But I realized that I need to talk about grief in a way that was philosophically substantial. And there wasn't a particularly substantial or well-developed literature here. So part of it was just opportunity, I suppose you could say. But beyond that, I guess my own conception of what philosophy can or should do is that, yes, philosophy investigates problems that are, I suppose, by contemporary lights, academic in some sense, the problems that philosophers discover. But I also think that philosophy should help us navigate problems that human beings encounter in ordinary human lives. And that's very much what I think, for example, some of the ancient philosophers, the Epicureans, the Stoics were trying to do.
Yeah.
And I certainly, vis-a-vis my relationship or the relationship of my work to the sciences and in particular to psychiatry, I think of these things, of these disciplines as operating, in concert. I'm quite conscientious in my book, I hope, about making sure that what I say about grief accords well with what the science says about grief, but at the same time wanting to carve out a distinctive space where I think philosophy can make a contribution by looking at these kind of questions about the nature of grief experience, the value of grief experience, how we should think of it as fitting into the overall kind of pattern of a well-lived human life.
So, yeah, Michael, talking about this aspect in this broad brushstroke idea of that grief is actually a growth opportunity or a deepening, I think is the term you use.
Yeah. Well, as I said, when I began plumbing what philosophers had said about grieving, one other thing that surprised me is that the prevailing view, I guess, particularly among ancient thinkers, was somewhat hostile to grief, right? A lot of
Yeah.
the ancient thinkers seem to view the fact that a person grieves as an indication that the person really hadn't achieved virtue. And those thinkers, had this sort of view because they thought that the virtuous life was a life that was, sort of invulnerable to facts outside ourselves, facts in the wider world, including, facts like, the deaths of other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for them, right, grieving was something to be acknowledged, at most begrudgingly, right, and sort of to be tolerated. Um, Now, as you say, I do represent grief in my book as an opportunity for a certain kind of self-knowledge or self-understanding. I don't want to be sort of too Pollyanna-ish about that. I'm not suggesting that we should be delighted that those that matter to us die. Of course, it's one of the deep and puzzling problems of human life that we're mortal and we live lives with other mortals. So I'm not suggesting that we should be pleased, right, that that others die. But I think we should be pleased, or at least grateful, that our psyches have equipped us with this very rich capacity to grieve, to feel a wide range of emotions in response to the deaths of others. And I think that this is a tool that enables us both to have some sort of grasp, right, of the nature of our loss. So there's a sort of dimension of grief that I think looks sort of backward in our biographies, but at the same time, a dimension of grieving that it enables us to also, look forward, right, to figure out, how we're going to live our lives, what kinds of values and commitments we're going to have, given that, we can't have the same sorts of values and commitments that we had when this person who mattered to us was alive. So I do think of grief as a tool. It can be used well or badly, but I think we should be glad that we have this tool.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of in the examination of emotions. It's one of the fundamental drives that Jacques Panksepp talked about, was grieving. And one of the things I find so interesting, which is why we wanted to talk to you, that there are so many common elements in actually dealing with on a psychotherapeutic level, on a practical level. I mean, one of the elements that certainly, and I've got a number of grieving patients. Matt's had, things over the time, long term, but he was working in the emergency services, so he had sort of very instantaneous traumas and griefs there. But it was this idea that people would say, I'm terribly, terribly upset. What will I do? And I kind of would say to them, well, this is a good thing, because wouldn't it be awful if this person had died and you didn't care? It was sort of like, woohoo, they're gone, which of course, unfortunately, I do hear some stories about that story. But you talk about our identity being invested, that there's a relationship between who we think we are in concerns with the other person.
That's right. And one of the puzzles that, begins the book is the puzzle of just explaining who it is that we grieve for, right? I don't think we should feel the slightest bit ashamed or worried by the fact that, people die all the time. And in most cases, I don't grieve those people, you don't grieve those people. They're basically anonymous to us. Maybe we feel a little tinge of dismay at that fact. But one of the puzzles that begins the book is just trying to figure out, what kinds of relationships, right, we can have with others, such that those relationships prompt grief, right, when the person in question dies. So one of the things that actually, kind of motivated me or inspired me a little bit in this book is, seeing the emergence in online culture and social media culture of, grieving of, celebrities, public figures, politicians, pop stars. I think that's all kind of come out into the open, right? Thanks to, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so forth. And as I see it, this looks like a genuine, sort of grief, right? There's no reason to kind of treat it as second rate. And I think that's a challenging phenomenon to incorporate into an account of grief because, our paradigmatic cases, I suppose, are, the grieving the death of parents, of spouses, of siblings, and so forth. So what I was hoping to achieve is, some sort of account that would make sense of how, on the one hand, you might grieve the death of David Bowie, but also grieve the death of your grandmother and also, your uncle. And how can we make sense of this in a unified way? So my answer, in effect, is that, we invest our own identities in other people. but the nature of the investment can vary from person to person. So, maybe in the case again of a pop star, their music may have been, very crucial to a stage of your life, or perhaps you're a musician yourself. Maybe you've emulated their work. In the case of a political leader, perhaps you voted for the person, or have tried to carry on that person's agenda or political program. And of course, in the case of friends, loved ones, spouses, we invest in them insofar as we love them, we're intimate with them, we're attached to them, we share life projects with them. So this is a classic problem of trying to find the unity within the diversity of a phenomenon. And I hope that I found the unity by appeal to this notion of investing our practical identity in others.
Right. Now, you might have covered this before I came on. I'm not sure. Obviously, death is pervasive. Everyone dies. And so death and grief is pervasive. And one might just be going right back to very basics here. But as Richard said, my experience in emergency services and then later as a counselor, it does seem that in the Western world, we don't do grief very well. It's often seen as pathology, and so what is it about? Well, Western culture is what I know, that we this thing that is all around us and all pervasive. Why don't we do it so well?
Well, my guess actually, Matt, is probably that some people do it well and some people don't. Right? Probably it's a very uneven sort of reality there. But I think one of the things that people who study death and mortality from a sociological or anthropological perspective, so not so much me, but one of the things that they have observed is that Western cultures at one point had a I guess sort of shared frame of reference, right, for thinking about grieving. So if you were to imagine Britain, where I am, or Australia, the United States, much of Europe, say late 19th century. There were, I guess, if you will, sort of scripted protocols and, widely shared rituals, right, that served, I suppose, as the kind of framework within which people could engage their grieving. And there was a pretty widely shared understanding of, what mourning was for and, how long you should mourn and who mourns whom and, a fairly thick, right, kind of cultural landscape, right, with respect to grieving and mourning. I think what we have seen, from roughly the beginning of the 20th century, in no small measure, I think, because of the declining influence, perhaps, of Protestant Christianity, is that there is, less of a shared script, right? Less of a shared cultural background and less of a sort of assumed pathway, right, for people's grieving to unfold. Now that has its downsides, right? I think people are a little bit less sure, right, about how to grieve, when to grieve, what opportunities are available to them to grieve. And I suppose one of the things I'm trying to do as a philosopher is give people a bit of guidance or a bit of a roadmap, a conceptual roadmap to thinking about what's happening to them when they're grieving. So I'd like to think I've done a bit of a service. But at the same time, I think that dissolution of sort of cultural common ground around grief is not entirely a bad thing, because I think what you're starting to see is people recognizing, right, the importance of engaging with one's mortality and engaging with grief, and trying to tailor it to their own values, aspirations, and so forth. So you have these phenomena like green funerals and other kinds of emerging mourning phenomena, where I think people are kind of saying, let us create our own rituals that reflect our own values, commitments, outlook on the world. So I think we're coming out of a period of transition, right, cultural transition, and I'm hoping, right, that philosophers like myself and other scholars of death and dying, people in the mental health professions, will support, right, a more robust, right, cultural engagement with mortality and with grieving. I think we still need it.
Yeah. So this idea that it's now legit to do grief our own way. There's not a set script we have to follow.
And I wonder if we could, if it's reasonable to expand it out, because I know in some of the areas I work with, I've certainly worked the grief of death of personal partner or someone, an identity figure. But it's also this sense of loss. And I've dealt with some very interesting and rather testing cases of people who, and just as a great example, I had an 80-year-old woman whose husband walked in and said, "I'm sorry, I've never loved you. I'm running off with the woman next door," and just walked out of her life. And we had a long grieving sort of process, and it took a very interesting turn. You might be interested. She talked the whole time. She just talked. Very talkative woman. And I realized about halfway through the first or second session that what she was doing was she was telling me the story of her life in the singular, which is really interesting. And so she retold her story of her life over a period of 10 or 12 weeks, quite a long period of time, in the singular. And then she seemed to feel much better. So this idea of loss and what you call is not re-identifying yourself, but actually expanding and taking your identity into a new phase.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I think of grieving as offering us an opportunity to rebuild, reconstruct, choose your preferred metaphor, our own practical identities, the sense of ourselves as valuable and having reasons to pursue different sorts of enterprises, different sorts of commitments, goals, etc. So, as we were discussing earlier, I think we should be grateful that, again, our psyches have equipped us with this, very rich source of potential insight, right, into what we care about, what we want to care about, how we want to proceed forward in the world. In one of my articles, that was published before the book, I sort of described grief as something like an emotional data dump, right? It's sort of like sort of the psyche kind of overflowing with, sort of evidence about what matters to us and sort of how we understand our biographies and so on. But your example of the woman whose husband, divorced her after a long period of time, certainly underscores, something that I've heard people say about my work, which I welcome at some level, which is that I'm placing grief perhaps along a continuum of traumas, right? Responses to loss of various kinds. And I certainly have no objection to that. But at the same time, I do think that the grief that is prompted by the deaths of others is perhaps distinctive, right, among the losses of relationships that we can undergo, right? For one thing, it's permanent and irreversible, right? Other kinds of losses are sometimes in principle, reversible. I like to point out to people that, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, I can't remember how many times they broke up. And or something,
yeah.
Right? So, even if you think that relationship is over, maybe it's not. So, death is obviously an irreversible change in a relationship that we have with someone else. Secondly, I think it's also an interesting phenomenon vis-a-vis other kinds of traumas because, we know from a fairly early age that everyone, that we'll ever encounter will die. And that's not true of other kinds of events that are trauma provoking, right? We don't know for sure that, we will divorce or we will, lose a friendship or whatever. And yet, right, we grieve, the deaths of others knowing full well that, their deaths were going to happen someday, right? Maybe they would, maybe our deaths would precede them, of course. And then a third feature, I think, is that, I think that the experience of grief that we feel at the deaths of others sends a very deep shockwave through us because it reminds us of the contingency of everything, right, that we can invest in, including the contingency of ourselves, right? I mean, it is itself a kind of potent mortality reminder. So, as I say, I'm glad to see my account of grief as perhaps locating, as I said, on a spectrum of kind of traumas we can undergo. But I do think that the grief we feel at the deaths of others has some distinguishing features that, merit putting it, in a special spotlight.
Yeah.
Yes, I was just thinking that we get a sense of what degrees of we get an insight into our dependence, our independence, and our interdependence. And of course, this can be overwhelming and disturbing. So it can be very, very helpful to go along and talk to someone, sort of a counselor, a therapist of some sort. But it's also very helpful to go along and talk to people who are comfortable about your cultural framework, perhaps a religious or pastoral care. This other problem that we have in the Western culture of doing everything on your own. Is that something that you found able to be discussed, or is that something that what does that arise?
Well, I actually probably have to be agnostic about that. I'm not a mental health professional, and I wouldn't profess to have expertise about what the best ways for people to go about
Yeah,
grieving are. But I do think, right, that people do need, right, other people in the course of grieving. Who they need is maybe a bit more of an intricate question, whether
yeah,
they,
yeah.
sort of need medical attention or psychiatric attention or, the attention of religious leaders and so forth.
Just the dog.
Um, or just the dog,
Yeah,
or the favorite books from one's library, or whatever it
yeah,
is.
yeah,
So, I mean, I do think that one of the things that fascinates me most on the side of what people might call the phenomenology of grief, right? How people experience it, is that grief is so often a very disorienting experience to people, right? They feel
Mm.
that the world and even themselves are suddenly kind of strange and alien and unfamiliar. They return to their dwellings or their workplaces, and those places seem unusual or somehow not as welcoming or as familiar as they did before. C.S. Lewis, in his very interesting, grief memoir, Grief Observed, talks about how the grief he experienced at the death of his wife put him in a position where he had trouble recognizing his own body. Right? His own body seemed,
Yeah, this
sort of like, what is this
dissociative.
thing?
Mm.
It's me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, the sense of confusion, disorientation of the world having been kind of upended, I
Mm.
think is very fascinating and very powerful in a lot of grief experiences. And that's, I kind of think, where other people can play a very powerful role, right? Because they're, others are in this common world with us, and I think they can help keep us, grounded in that common world, help us figure out how to find our way back to a world that's more familiar, comfortable, not so alienated. But as I say, I think different strokes for different folks as far as what people might need, grief wise.
Yeah, I definitely have heard, when it comes to very close relationships, so a spouse, who has died, this aspect of dissociation does seem to be common. So there's something about the intimacy there, the strength of the relationship, which really, is so strong that it causes this dissociative, I don't
Yeah.
know, episode, period.
Yeah. And in a mundane way, right, with relationships like that, where someone else is so stitched into the fabric of your day to day life, there's just going to be all these sort of
Missing bits.
moments, I guess,
Yeah.
moments where you sort of, have this friction with the reality that they're not there anymore, right? So, what are you doing making breakfast for two,
yes, yes. That's a common story, isn't it? Yeah.
Who's going to, I guess I'm going to have to do all the laundry now. And, all these kinds of, adaptations just to very mundane realities. And so, I think, again, grief is a tool to enable us to adapt to a world where, someone who mattered to us is now absent. And I think we should think of grieving as our primary, psychic resource for figuring out how to, continue forward in the world.
I mean, there was a very interesting sort of phenomenological expression of this using those terms, but basically just a dramatization of it. I don't know whether you saw it. Ricky Gervais did a series called Afterlife.
Yeah.
And it went through. As I'm thinking about your book and I'm thinking about the pathway that he took, we talked dissociation, we talked about, incredible sort of, dependence, and then the lack of ability to engage, loss of change of essence with life. And really, as he went through the story, it was underneath was always, but what are you learning? Where are you growing? These beautiful little conversations on the chair with the older lady who also had the husband. So it's interesting in that his just creative, intuitive sense of things. Really, your book tells a similar story.
I think so. As I said, definitely I want to present grief as an opportunity to create something good. Against, again, a background of one of the more distressing features of human life, which is, we are mortals living with other mortals, and sometimes we just have to confront that fact, and it's, kind of unavoidable when they die. So, But the notion again of having an opportunity to reconstruct the self, to reconstruct your own identity, to figure out how this relationship that you had with the deceased has to change. I think that's a powerful, task that grief makes available to us, and I think it provides us the capacity to undertake that task. And as I see it, it's a kind of catalyst, right, for a kind of necessary change, right? I think one of the worst things that can happen to us, in a sense, right, is to sort of, frankly, live in the past, right? To sort of want to live in a world where the realities around us haven't changed, right? And that's difficult for we human beings. I think we're sort of temperamentally, if you will, small c conservatives, right? We sort of want the things that matter to us to stick around, and things that make us feel at home in the world to stick around. And sadly, right, one of the things that cannot stick around in many cases is other people. And so it is again grief is again a tool to enable us to adapt, but I think that it would be a great misfortune to someone if they never sort of updated their way of being in the world to reflect the death, right, of somebody that mattered to them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems to me that for some people, it's just naturally motivating. They say there's a death of a peer, and so the motivation was, well, it's a realization that time is short. Okay, so I'm going to live on purpose now, or I don't know, a death of a child. So I'm going to live on purpose for that child now, and so terribly spontaneously motivating. And for others, it seems to be really demotivating, and they get themselves caught into a downward spiral of depression.
Yeah, well, of course, that's what I imagine we want people to be able to avoid. I think that to the extent that a mere philosopher like me can contribute to ameliorating that sort of thing, I think one message of my book is to view grief, in a positive light, right? I think one of the things we don't want to do is, if you will, shoot the messenger, right? And if what we're trying to do is trying to suppress grief or avoid it or confine it in artificial ways, then what we're really doing is sort of looking in the mirror and saying, this thing that's happened, I'm going to ignore, right? Ignore it to the extent possible. Ignore the things that my psyche is telling me, matter here. So I think most people, and this is my read of the evidence from psychology, do manage grief reasonably well. They come out of it okay. But I think certainly one of the ways that they can come out of it not okay is when they just have great difficulty staying with it, confronting it, engaging with it. But also, I think one of the challenges it does present is sometimes it requires a probing, right, investigation of relationships, and sometimes that can be painful.
Yes, there's that interesting thing. There was a little sentence in your sort of promotional blurb, but it was lovely. It was, it's sort of the book tells us how grief leads to a greater depth of our understanding of our humanity, and it is an interesting thing. Is on a paleoanthropological and anthropological investigation, that was actually one of the determiners of people beginning to think, oh, this species is shifting into there's something changing with them, when we began to have some recognition of death, when there were burials, when there were starting to be artifacts that were left with dead bodies. And that this was actually something that came into our space on an evolutionary frame.
Right, and that certainly, it's the first place, or a first place, right, that anthropologists, often begin in trying to understand a culture, is looking at its ways of thinking about the dead and thinking about grieving. And I guess, our capacity to grieve and our capacity to think about the dead, sort of speaks to the emergence of a kind of intelligence, right, that incorporates, imagination and the ability to sort of think counterfactually and that sort of thing, right? Our ability to kind of, imagine, what would the world have been like if she had continued to live, or, something like that. So, our ability to engage with what is not, right, I think is in some sense, one of our most powerful cognitive features, but it's also an imaginative and emotional feature too. And of course, that in turn I think explains why grieving has been such a popular subject in the arts, in poetry, in drama, in television, and without grieving, right? Some of these things have no subject matter almost, right? I mean, what's poetry without grief, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And,
so,
and also this idea we're still trying to get it, understand it. And so your book is that's interesting. No, it's just occurred. We continue to discuss it as if we still don't get it. And perhaps it is something that is almost impossible for us to truly grasp with the brain we've got at this stage. And so it still needs to be tumbled around.
I guess. I mean, I am reluctant, in my own work to want to be, too directive, to people about, what their grief will be like or how they should engage with it.
Yeah.
In part because, I just don't know it. I'd have to know a lot more about you, right, to really say anything coherent about your grieving. Mm. But I think, if we have available to us, sets of concepts, roadmaps, if you will, that allow us to understand and articulate, right, our experience, then I think we feel less lost, right? And I think, one thing philosophy can do is develop sets of concepts or link sets of concepts together, help us see relationships among, different facets of our experience, and thereby, give people a bit of an anchor for, again, an experience that can be, pretty bewildering and difficult to understand at a first personal level, right? I'm in no position to tell anybody, what their own grief is likely to be like. Right?
Yeah,
that's got a whole lot to do with the idiosyncrasies of that person and the idiosyncrasies of the relationship in question, right? The relationship with the deceased. What I hope I can do again is give people some vocabulary to talk about their experience that's faithful to it at some level, and again take a bit of the mystery and maybe some of the fear and maybe some of the apprehension out of grieving.
Yeah. There's been a few bits of interesting research which have been helpful for people to understand the how, what the experience is going to be like. And one which I thought was very interesting was that they looked at the intensity of the emotional grief experience, and they found that over a lengthy period of time, there was a longitudinal study, that actually the intensity didn't diminish, but what it was the frequency and the duration. Was the thing that diminished. And I know I've got a client who I've been seeing for quite a few years now, and the distance between the very difficult days is extending. But when the difficult days are just as difficult now as they were in the very first place. So there's a biopsychosocial interaction that is in play.
Mm. Yes, and I don't know if there's such research. I suspect there probably is. I'm just not aware of it. But I'd be very interested to learn more about the particulars of grieving at different life stages, and in particular maybe the differences between sort of first griefs in people's autobiography, and then sort of subsequent griefs, and how these differ. There's some very nice philosophical work recently done by a philosopher at New York University, Samuel Scheffler, talking about aging as a sort of problem where, among other things, one is kind of perpetually, repeatedly confronting grief because so many people who are close to you are near death, and he thinks that there's some pretty profound philosophical questions about valuing that one has to confront as we age. It's so interesting too, thinking about first grieving. As I said, one of the things that motivated my interest in this topic was my students, talking about death and mortality by reference to grief. And, one thing they're very interested in is the grief that we feel at the deaths of pets, which I'm guessing for many people, that is the first grief that they undergo.
Because they live shorter, they live shorter lifespans. Unless you've got a turtle or something, tortoise.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're good learning experiences, aren't they? Because, I mean, the first sort of experience we have of major grief is when it happens to us. And, where it's not like we take courses in grief, in high school or anything like that. And so these little things like the death of a pet is, they're great learning experiences. And as you said, too, we're talking more openly about these things. We're displaying these things on social media as we're, grieving over, the death of, a pop star or something like that. And so that's a bit of an introduction, I guess, to the grief that you'll experience when it happens closer to home?
Yes, I definitely think that social media has it has made grieving more public in a sense, but not quite public in the sense that it was, again, say a century ago, right? I think it's again more of a medium in which people, craft or represent their grieving to others, in part, to create circles or communities of grief. And I do really think it's fascinating to see how these sort of communities spring up, almost immediately, right, with the death of a prominent person, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I was asking my own students recently, is there anyone, whose death would prompt like near universal grief in the human species, right? And the one that they came up with, which I, think is a pretty credible case, actually, God forbid, is Paul McCartney. Right. Someone, the sort of generation spanning figure, beloved, by many, many, many people. And, good luck, Paul. I hope you survive many, many more years to come. But when it does come, I think it's true, right? You'll see grieving maybe on a kind of scale, right? That it's probably, I'm not sure, unprecedented, but close to it, so many people from, interacting around this.
Well, I mean, I guess we've had, Princess Diana was
she comes to mind. Yeah,
Elvis Presley was a huge, and these,
Mandela.
it's a very interesting aspect of how we what we still need to know, and this is what Matt and I are very keen to talk about with therapists, and it's not just about the technical knowledge; it's also about this deeper understanding of how this thing ticks over, and I love the way that you've described the individuality of the experience. That we can give some generalities, but when it comes down to the individual experience, there's no predicting. It is a truly complex, unpredictable event.
Yes, and I think there's questions about grief that I've, despite the fact that I've, thought about these issues as a philosopher a fair bit, that I still find difficult to tackle. I mean, I think one big one is one that I gestured at earlier. We know that those in whom we invest our practical identity may die, right? Mm-hmm. So, and this is not, a mystery to us. We're quite aware of this. The research I've read says that, children understand sort of the ubiquity, universality of death, sometime around the age of 3 or 4. So we know this throughout our lives. And yet, right, when they die, it still has this sort of, feel of a shock to the system, and we feel caught unaware and unprepared and so forth. And, why is that? Yeah. We've in a certain sense known it's coming. Maybe we don't know the details or the exact circumstances, but, we've known it's coming, and yet we grieve. And so I think there's some deep implications of that, that maybe in some sense we need to allow ourselves to be surprised by grief, so that we can continue to engage with these relationships, right? If you're sort of already, kind of grieving relationships before they're even done, that's probably not a good way to be in the relationships, probably not a good way to enjoy them, to get the benefits of them. So, we kind of need to, I think, cordon off this reality in order to enjoy these relationships, get the maximal benefit from them. But at the same time, once, the crisis comes, right, when the other partner in this relationship dies, there is this shock to the system in many cases. And as I said, I'd like to think that grief is a chance for us to, rebuild ourselves and take stock of our losses. Again, it's a tool that responds to something that's a great difficulty in human life, right? But, we should be glad that we've got this tool.
And maybe one of the biological, psychobiological mechanisms from which philosophy has found some emergence. I don't know. We have to thinking about these death and dying things.
Sure. Well, famously, right, Socrates says philosophy is preparation for death. That's not a good slogan for the discipline, I should say.
I must go study some of that.
A whole lot of students come to study it for that reason. But I think, if, the heart of philosophy is reflection upon the human condition, certainly I would say, paramount feature of the human condition is not merely mortality, but our awareness of it and the ways in which our lives are structured by that awareness, right?
Yeah.
In the background of I think so much of what we do is a deep and tacit understanding, right, of the limits of human biography, of our finitude, and how we wrestle with that and how we live with that. I think is one of the big challenges of human life. Right.
Michael, before we wrap up, any sort of final words you'd like to leave for our listeners?
Well, since so many of your listeners are in the psychotherapeutic community, I would say that my book and my other research is definitely an effort to build bridges between philosophers and people in the mental health professions. The mental health professions have their origins in some sense in philosophy. In concerns for human flourishing and figuring out how to navigate human problems. And I think that I'd like to think that I did a good job representing, the current science on grief in the book, and trying to say things that are consistent with that, but also staking out a bit of territory for philosophers to make a contribution here, and also to again invite the mental health community to think about grief in particular as a problem that is sort of endemic to the human condition. Right. And to figure out ways to, treat their patients such that the patients themselves appreciate that fact. Right. That this is not, it's not COVID. Right. It's not this disease that strikes some and not others. Right.
Yes.
It's again more of a much more deeply rooted fact about human life.
Yeah. Well, that's a very, very beautiful and engaging way to bring the topics, this idea of philosophy and psychotherapy into a collective frame, which is exactly what encourages me to think to continue being a psychotherapist. It's not just about wheedling around fixing up problems. It's about engaging the human spirit and finding ways to use these events to create something more. And surely that's why these things have happened, or why they're evolving in the way they're evolving. So thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, for writing the book. Thank you so much for talking to us. We look forward to the next one when you figured out some more stuff.
Yeah. Well, keep your eyes peeled. I'll certainly be continuing to think and write about mortality and also some professional ethics issues in the mental health profession. So
beautiful. Well, we'd love it. When that comes up, we'd love to talk to you about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael.
Sure.